Are monthly mortgage payments typically more than renting? My wife and I are thinking of buying in the next 18 months. We consider ourselves well off financially and live in a middle of cost of living area for California where houses are around $500,000. We were recently pre approved at 7.5%. That is such a disgusting rate. We have 80K to put down and still maintain a 6-month emergency fund. Using Google's mortgage calculator, including taxes and fees, the estimated monthly on a 500K house with 80K down is close to $4,000 a month. We currently pay 2660 to rent a single family home. Is this typical? I suppose if we buy, we won't need to save as much cash every month like we have to build the down payment. It still seems like a lot of money even if we are financially doing well. Now, to my understanding, I believe California, the main way that homeowners, investors that go into these real estate, into these properties, aren't doing it for the rental income, they're doing it for the appreciation because for some reason California appreciates like crazy, right? That's why you end up having like mega mansions in California. I'm talking like 20 million, 30 million, right? Being rented out at a much cheaper rate than what a mortgage for that property would actually be just because they know that 20 or 30 million dollar property like 5, 8, 10 years down the line might be worth double, triple, or even quadruple that. Like it's absolutely insane. So the real estate market in California is just like really weird, right? It's a very weird state to be involved with real estate in because it's not like almost any other state where you could get a mortgage on that home and what the rent would be for that home would be pretty similar, right? The rent would typically be slightly above what the mortgage would be at that specific time. And then 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, the rent for that same property would actually be increased, probably double or triple, but your mortgage payment would stay the same. So technically, if you were to rent it out later down the line, you would technically have a much better cash flow. So what I mean by this is, let's do this. So basically, let's say that in pretty much any other state other than California, right? You're able to, at this time, get a mortgage payment of $2,000, right? And like, I don't know, let's just say that the house cost Mm, costs like 300,000. Let's just say that, right? Well, the rent you could pretty much get probably about like 2,500, right? Like that's probably how much it would cost to rent that exact same property at this specific time, right? Now, 10 years down the line, you're still paying the $2,000 mortgage if you had a mortgage on it. But 10 years down the line, if you were to rent that same property, the exact same property, the rent might be 3,000 now, might be 3,500 now. Oh, 3,500 now, might even be 4,000 now, depending on how in demand that area is, right? So, the main thing about getting a mortgage for a property, unlike any other area, or like basically any area other than California, you could pretty much assume that over time it would be cheaper for you to have the mortgage than to rent the property because your mortgage payment would stay the same, but the rent will increase over time in basically every single area. Now, with California, you might have like a $5 million property, right? But you might only be able to get like $15,000 per month for that, right? But the mortgage payment might be, I don't know, like 60 grand or 30 grand per month. So it doesn't even make sense to actually have a mortgage on that property. So again, what a lot of people in California do will literally just buy the property to hold it. They will hold it until a time, probably about 5 to 10 years, maybe even longer, where the property value of that home has either doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled. So that like 15, well, whatever, like the $5 million home, right, might be worth 10 mil now, right? So they were basically bleeding money for multiple years until they end up selling it for like a few $1 million profit. So in that case, it makes sense for them to basically buy a super overpriced home or property in California because they have enough money to literally bleed for years, like financially bleed for years, to then basically make a profit on the back end on the appreciation. So again, California is a very, very weird real estate market. Like people need to keep that in mind. And I would definitely not be buying a house that costs $500,000 with a 7.5% rate. That is such a disgusting rate for that price of a home. So let's see some of these comments. So there's a long-term benefit to a fixed rate mortgage over renting as the cost of rent increases over time. Even if the mortgage payment is higher when you first buy, assuming you live in a desirable area, it's likely that the cost to rent 10 to 15 years in the future will be higher than your mortgage payment due to inflation. Against this, you need to weigh the cost of upkeep on a house. A lot of people forget about this, and it is huge. When I bought my house, the mortgage was about the same as renting a similar property. Now, 15 years later, rent has tripled. Don't you also have to factor in repair and upkeep costs for owning? I try to think about rent annually as being the max cost I pay versus owning, and a mortgage potentially being the minimum cost. Not every area is different. CA has really high mortgages compared to rent. Exactly what I was saying. Thanks to Prop 13, I can't afford a house in the area, but can afford to rent since my landlord pays like zero property tax, having owned the building for almost 30 years. Like others said, area dependent. When I was in CA, renting was cheaper. Here in Georgia, it's the opposite. Rent is generally higher than a mortgage on an all else equal basis, even after escrow is factored in, even at current rates. Houses just skyrocketed here in the past 2 years, so most renters can't get approved for their current home prices, even though their payment would be less. The banks don't care about that. Every area is different. I'm also in CA, and the same is true for me. It's cheaper to rent. The other factor is the fact that interest rates are probably adding what, 1K per month to your monthly expected costs? 7% now versus 3% a few years ago. In the long term, you could see a benefit as rates go down and rent goes up. You'd be able to refinance and potentially pay less than the average rental. Are you really looking at apples to apples pricing? By nature, renting will always be more expensive than owning, including maintenance, etc. But people tend to look at much nicer houses to buy than what they rent, even if it's not the house itself, but the neighborhood. Now, currently, would suspect the pricing has not caught up, yet rental-wise would expect large increases in the coming years. Of course, you can have the outlier, the landlords that's owned the place for decades and does not look to adjust their pricing to market rates. Let's see. So a person could have bought a house 20 years ago and refinanced when rates were low. That's 20 years of inflation and housing market increases along with a lower rate than now. That allows them to charge lower rent versus a person buying building rental property today. So yeah, feel free to give your thoughts on this, but in my point of view, it's very area dependent, specifically state wise, but also do what makes best for yourself financially, right? If you're in a situation right now where it is much cheaper to rent than it is to pay for a mortgage, there's nothing wrong with paying rent at this time of life that you're in, right? Because again, people need to understand personal finance is personal. So do what is best for you right now so that in the future you could live a much better life. Because if you spread yourself too thin now, you might really spread yourself too thin in the future to the point where you may not even have a place to stay yet. So it's just something to think about. And maybe potentially buy a home that's actually within your budget. I mean, if they could find maybe a condo for less than 500K, maybe like 400K, 300K, maybe that's a better option for them. It's just something to think about. There's different ways to get at the answer.